baseline pull, or?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we got 480 foot-pounds of torque and 400 horsepower out of it. That's kind of the baseline pull.
Yeah.
Customer with the 2020 Raptor that put extremely large turbochargers. They replaced the OEM turbos with some pretty big turbochargers, and the ECM struggles to richen the truck up quick enough to prevent a whole bunch of knock retard from coming into the ECM and then retarding timing further, and it ends up making lower power than what it should. So we're just modifying the ECM contents to be able to change the state at which the engine starts to deliver fuel to the motor, so it doesn't lean out so quickly. And that's what we're doing. That's one of the things we're doing. Factory calibration. There's the intercooler heat, so we did one more pull. It dynoed 400 with modified turbos, factory. And then on the second pull right away it lost 20 horsepower, 19 horsepower. And then on the third pull it lost 7 horsepower. And the foot-pounds of torque are going down by 10 between pulls. This is like 120 some degree air temp hammering. 120 some degree air temp hammering it. Or sorry, not. This is just the 419 is me loading it on the dyno with a brake until it sweeps all the hot air past that sensor, the inlet air manifold charge temp sensor, and then if I don't use the brake and sweep that out a couple times, it doesn't make shit. It's like it probably would perform pretty well on the street. only made about 460 really safe horsepower on 91 octane fuel, and on E30, so there's just not a lot of ethanol in the tank, but on E30 we made 500. So we get questions about, well, gosh, on the internet there's trucks out there that are like making, 550. Well, there's issues with that. 550 on this setup, one, is above the limit of what the manufacturer of these turbos rate them at, and two, there's a bunch of, and since they're rating them at rear wheel horsepower and this truck was on 35-inch tires, there's a lot of understandings about rotational weight and driveline losses on this truck. This is more than likely 580 or 90 rear wheel engine crank horsepower, so we didn't want to push the truck any harder, but there's plenty of knock control in the ECM, plenty of gas and plenty of airflow to make a higher power. We just don't want to blow the turbos up, on the truck. We don't want to push them beyond what they rate them at, and that's kind of why we leveled off right at 500 horsepower on E30, just to be extremely safe in the truck. Another significant item to note is torque. So we have a bunch of pulls around 700 foot-pounds of torque, and that's a monster number. That's not really achievable on pump gas. We would just run out of pre-ignition, or it's called low-speed pre-ignition on these trucks. There's just not enough overhead in the gas in like pump gas to be able to deal with that type of torque, with that type of air load. And the E30 mix allows us to push the torque numbers that high. We have some dyno graphs that show that, but it's not really beneficial to run torque that high on these motors. One, the transmission can't deal with that down the road, that big of a torque hit, and two, it's just not sustainable. If the user were to find kind of a bad tank of fuel, the engine would run into a lot of knock and then extract a ton of power out of the ECM. So those are the findings that we had, and actually some of the challenges with the ECM. And then they went to larger turbos, so there's a lot of understandings inside these newer ECMs with turbo speed and turbo speed control. There isn't a way to measure turbo shaft speed on these twin turbo gas direct injected Ecoboost. There just isn't. So the ECM calculates turbo speed to push these engines a little bit harder while keeping the boost at somewhat sane levels. We have to run our own calculations to make sure that we're not going to blow the turbos up on over speeding them. And normally the overspeed events come from really high torque at a fairly low RPM as the turbo's trying to drive airflow up. So, but anyways, we came out with a pretty good product. We're keeping boosts around 20 pounds on across the board, about 20 pounds of boost, maybe floating up into that 21, 22 range. The truck recovers pretty well on the road as far as like heat and heat rejection from the intercooler. So on the dyno, we made 8 500 horsepower pulls back to back, and we lost about a horsepower per pull, and that was pretty representative of 2 degrees of intercooler heat soak. So we're losing about horsepower per 2 degrees of intercooler heat soak, and that's kind of what we found on the AEM intercooler. The factory intercooler is going to be the same. It's just not going to recover as quick. So on the road, if you floor it and heat soak comes up, it takes a little longer to reject that amount of heat. So that's kind of the benefit and what we found out on the Ecoboost as far as factory heat rejection, and then the aftermarket intercooler heat rejection. The larger turbos are pretty good for rapid spool up. We didn't really even notice a difference in spool up between a factory turbo and these. We just noticed that there's 30 or 40 horse that can be sustained on these turbos, because at 20 pounds of boost, shaft speed's quite a little bit lower per per given horsepower. The other things we did in the calibration, we disabled the auto start shut off, so it doesn't turn off when it comes to the top of the hill. In the SCT software, you can turn it back on if he wants to with the handheld device. With HP tuners, he wouldn't be able to. We adjusted tire size. He runs like 37s on this, so you can adjust the tire size up and down with SCT. We obviously calibrated it for that. Changed some of the lockup controls, so like we're going uphill right now, we pull the truck out of 10th gear right away so it can run around that peak torque value going up, going uphill, versus lugging the motor in 10th gear at highway speeds. That's pretty beneficial when you go to such a large tire, because it shifts the center point of the torque down to a lower road value. So if it would have been going down the road at 2,000 RPMs before, with these large of tires, it's going down the road at like 1,600 or 1,700. So it's important for low speed pre-ignition, LISP on these motors to shift the torque to keep the motor centered around peak torque, or very close to peak torque, versus lugging it like we would, or allow some of our diesel calibrations to do. We don't want all the cylinder pressure to just kind of beat this motor to death. Yeah, so that's kind of why we shift those calibrations around. Tire pressure monitors, we can change those with SCT and HP tuner software, so we did that. We also use ForeScan to put some of the stuff up on the dash, as far as like your heated seat functionality, the heated steering wheel up on the dash, so we can, it's easier for the user to get right onto the screen and access those controls versus jump through a bunch of screens to find them. Those are things outside of SCT. That's a ForeScan thing. Disabled the top speed limiter. These were capped, I think, at 106, if I remember right. It's either 98 or 106, and we turned it. We raised it up a fair amount, so there's not enough power in the truck to hit what we're going to allow this thing to get to. There's Baja Mode in this truck. Being a Raptor, there's several different modes. So we allowed the truck to use all the torque that's on tap in Baja Mode. So if he's in kind of like playing around in the field, or I don't know, sending it off some pretty cool jumps, it would deliver full torque to the motor upon initial stab, versus the factory calibration backs these trucks down quite a little bit. It softens Baja Mode up a little bit, or sport mode, whatever you want to call it. So you can get on the gas extremely hard, or basically put it to the floor, and we would allow full torque to be delivered. And that's both in four-wheel drive high and four-wheel drive low and four-wheel drive auto. So it's always going to deliver whatever we allow max power to be in any mode. I think that's pretty much it as far as what we did, additional items to the truck.